Hey everyone, this is a piece titled Left Communism in the Revolutionary Era by Robert V. Daniels. It's a chapter from his book, The Rise and Fall of Communism in Russia, but I've read other parts of this book as essays, so I'm going to post it on the channel as Left Communism in the Revolutionary Era. It is not often appreciated that in the early revolutionary years, communist doctrines, ideals, and oratory were honestly and intensely believed by many in the movement. Revolution, of course, devours its children, and none were consumed more completely than the people most devoted to the revolution's original aims. Memory of these true believers is dim, but a backward glance at their efforts and aspirations helps to put the subsequent evolution of Soviet communism in a more accurate perspective. Quote, left communism, to extend generically the factional label used in 1918, was a more or less continuous tendency throughout the formative years of communism, almost always as an opposition to the official leadership. This kind of resistance was possible thanks to the political pluralism that persisted within the victorious Communist Party, even during the most violent and uncertain period of revolutionary struggle, the era of war communism between 1918 and 1921. Though opposition outside the party was suppressed step by step in the first half of 1918, internal communist opposition to Lenin's policies continued active and vocal until after the end of the Civil War. However futile, protests by this opposition were important in documenting the changing methods and direction of the nascent Soviet regime. The more famous struggle for the succession to Lenin in the 1920s was not as free or as profound in the issues it raised as the controversies of the war communism era. Not until General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev opened the way for political reform late in the day in the 1980s was a comparable debate possible over the fundamental principles of the Soviet system. At the psychological core of left communism was a dogmatic commitment to Marxian theory and an idealistic belief in the struggle for the perfect society. In pre-revolutionary times, there were people of this mind among both the Bolshevik and Menshevik factions of Russian social democracy. In the Bolshevik movement, the left-wingers are distinguished by their romantic attachment to utopia through insurrection, expressed in the long controversy over participation in the Tsarist Duma. The Menshevik left, Fyodor Dan, Yuli Martov, and others, thought in terms of international revolution and long rejected Bolshevism as a projection of Lenin's polemical style and disciplinarian methods. Prior to 1917, both currents of thought were centered in Russian émigré circles abroad and strongly reflected the influence of left-wing Marxism in Western Europe, with its democratic and even anarcho-syndicalist emphasis on international mass action. 3 short years after the inception of the Bolshevik movement in the social democratic split of 1903, the distinctive signs of the left communist tendency were making their appearance in the form of opposition to Lenin's leadership. In what way was Lenin not, quote, left, enough to satisfy the revolutionary appetites of the romantic hotheads whom Lenin had attracted into his Bolshevik organization? Initially, it was because Lenin disappointed their hopes for a renewed armed uprising on the model of Moscow in 1905. Lenin's decision in 1906 to put up Bolshevik deputies for the Duma in order to take advantage of its modest propaganda value evoked outrage on the part of 2 left groups. The Otsevists, recallists, wanted to recall the deputies, and the ultimatists demanded that they behave in a more revolutionary manner. Both groups stood up to challenge the Leninists in bitter controversy, not only in Russia but also in the emigration. The incipient left communism of the Otzovists and ultimatists was no mere flare-up of an insignificant fringe. Heading the opposition was Lenin's own second-in-command, the extraordinary physician-philosopher Alexander Bogdanov, real name Malinovsky, but no relation to Lenin's later favorite, the agent provocateur, Roman Malinovsky. Bogdanov was supported by another early Lenin lieutenant, Leonid Krasin, an engineer-turned-bomb maker who ended his career as Soviet Commissar of Foreign Trade, also by the leading Bolshevik intellectuals, the writer Maxim Gorky, the historian Mikhail Pokrovsky, the litterateur Anatoly Lunacharsky, and by a host of up-and-coming young Bolsheviks, including such future luminaries as Lev Kamenev and Nikolai Bukharin. From their tactical disagreements, the leftists moved on to theoretical speculation of a sort Lenin found intolerable. Gorky's, quote, God building, which represented socialism as a religion, and Bogdanov's sophisticated philosophy of knowledge, called, quote, imperial-monism. The latter was the target of Lenin's heavy-handed polemic, materialism and imperial criticism, one of the more obnoxious items in Lenin's collected works. But theoretical refutation was not enough for Lenin. In the summer of 1909, Lenin called a meeting of the Bolshevik leadership and formally expelled the, quote, left fools from what was not yet officially a party. This move was a landmark in developing the practice of totalitarian political control, and it would not be the last time left communism was made to serve as the anvil on which Lenin hammered out his formidable Russian contribution to 20th century culture. During the war years, a new, quote, left Bolshevik opposition, aiming to make the anticipated revolution total and international, made its appearance under the leadership of the great idealist of communism, Bukharin. But the issue of the war itself served to bring Lenin, the old and new left Bolsheviks, and the left Mensheviks back together on the common ground of internationalism and the defeatism that hoped to see Tsarism discredited. Cemented by absorption of Trotsky and most of the Menshevik left into the Bolshevik ranks in the summer of 1917, this alliance provided the bulk of the leadership that carried the Bolsheviks to a victory, discounted and feared by many of Lenin's closest lieutenants. In 1917, the Bolshevik Party was repeatedly shaken by controversies between the traditional Leninists and the rising tide of utopian enthusiasm. The left-leaning Bolshevik leadership that first surfaced in Petrograd in February was deposed by Stalin and Kamenev in March, but Lenin's return to Russia in April and his startling espousal of the overthrow of the provisional government threw the scales heavily toward the left. By October, only an overcautious remnant led by Zinoviev and Kamenev ventured to oppose armed insurrection openly, though few even of the romantic hotheads went as far as Lenin in espousing the tactics of a military coup and the establishment of a one-party dictatorship. In the end, the dream of proletarian revolution came to pass more by accident and by design. Both the left and right wings of Bolshevism were uneasy about the implications of absolute one-party rule. When, just after the Bolshevik coup, Lenin rejected the idea of sharing power with other socialist parties, 5 figures of the Bolshevik right, including Zinoviev, Kamenev, and the future Prime Minister Alexei Rykov, temporarily resigned from the party Central Committee in protest, and several newly appointed People's Commissars also turned in their government portfolios. Labor Commissar Alexander Shliapnikov, a member of the Bolshevik left, sided with the dissenters, while Bukharin, another left-wing stalwart, hoped for a compromise that would salvage the forthcoming Constituent Assembly. The only achievement of these protests was to create vacancies allowing temporary inclusion of the left SRs in the Council of People's Commissars. If the left wing of the Bolshevik Party shared the misgivings of the right in regard to one-party dictatorship, it was much more vigorous in its opposition to the new regime's actions in foreign affairs. A week after he dispersed the Constituent Assembly in January 1918, Lenin shocked his entire party by calling for peace with Germany and the temporary abandonment of revolutionary war. Lenin's critics in the right wing now joined Lenin in the Council of Caution, with the purists on the left, while the purists on the left were aghast. This realignment set up the ongoing confrontation between Lenin and the left opposition that continued in one form or another until 1921 and echoed throughout the 1920s. Bukharin and the opponents of peace in 1918 contended that the agreement with Germany would hamstring revolutionary Russia's mission to spread the socialist revolution internationally, and would thereby sacrifice the opportunity to win the foreign support that they deemed essential for the survival of the proletarian revolution in Russia itself. Argued Bukharin at the Seventh Party Congress in March 1918, quote, "The conditions of the peace, reduced to nothing the international significance of the Russian Revolution, The way out, is revolutionary war against German imperialism," end quote. Bukharin and his supporters were prepared to fall back to Siberia and wage guerrilla war against the enemy while appealing to the European workers to overthrow their respective governments and come to the aid of revolutionary Russia. If the Russian Revolution were thrown back upon itself, they feared, it would be obliged to compromise with bourgeois elements and turn into a system of state capitalism. Quote, "If the Russian Revolution were overthrown by violence on the part of the bourgeois counter-revolution," end quote, declared the internationalist Karl Radek, quote, It would rise again like a phoenix. If, however, it lost its socialist character and by this disappointed the working masses, this blow would have 10 times more terrible consequences for the future of the Russian and international revolutions. End quote. Karl Radek. Denoting themselves the quote, left communists, the Bukharin group mustered 4 votes against Lenin's 5 in the crucial decision by the Bolshevik Central Committee on the 28th of February 1918 to accept Germany's peace terms, while 4 other Central Committee members, following Trotsky's formula of no war, no peace, abstained. The narrow victory for Lenin made possible by this split in the left established the survival of the revolutionary Russian state as the first priority of Soviet foreign policy and relegated international revolution to the secondary, instrumental role that it continued to play throughout the life of the Soviet regime. In their outrage at the peace, the left communists held talks with the left SRs, who were equally opposed to the treaty, with the object, legitimate in a democratic sense, of removing Lenin as head of the government, forming a new ruling coalition and resuming the war. Though the left communists quickly backed out of the scheme, it was recalled and used against Bukharin when Bukharin was on trial for his life in 1938, with the new allegation that the opposition had planned to kill Lenin. Rebuffed when the Seventh Party Congress endorsed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the left communists, now led by the economist Valerian Osinsky-Obolensky, turned to issues of internal policy. They were utterly outraged by Lenin's new steps to create a bureaucratic chain of command in government and industry at the expense of the revolutionary philosophy of Soviets and workers' control, touted by the Bolshevik leader himself in State and Revolution. In the short-lived journal, Communists, they warned of, quote, the deviation of the Soviet power and the majority of the party on the ruinous path of petty bourgeois policies, end quote, and threatened that, quote, the left wing of the party will have to stand in the position of an effective and responsible proletarian opposition, end quote. Upon the outbreak of civil war in May 1918, the communist revolution took a sharp turn to the left, with the suppression of all remaining non-communist parties, the sweeping nationalization of private enterprise, and the forcible requisitioning of food from the peasantry. Viewing the Civil War as a fight for the immediate implementation of the utopian communist goal, the left communists temporarily closed ranks with the party majority in a life-and-death struggle for survival. The program adopted by the Communist Party at its 8th Congress in March 1919 fully embodied the spirit of the left in affirming, quote, proletarian democracy, quote, suppression of the resistance of the exploiters, and, quote, eventually the abolition of state authority, end quote. Meanwhile, after Germany's collapse in November 1918 eased pressure on the Soviet regime, new disagreements broke out between the leadership of the party and the party's left-wing elements. A distinct feature now appeared within left communism between the most idealistic tendency and the proponents of a more pragmatic and authoritarian approach to the future society. Trotsky and most of the left Menshevik recruits to Bolshevism fell into this latter category, the authoritarian approach to the future society, and filled high positions in the party leadership during war communism. At the same time, the purists again went into opposition. At the core of these new controversies was the degree of centralized power and autocratic methods being exercised in Lenin's government. One focus of contention was the new Red Army as Trotsky had set it up, with conventional military command and discipline and the employment of former Tsarist officers, the, quote, military specialists, end quote, or spetsy. This trend was resisted by communists still enamored of the democratized army of 1917 and informal guerrilla tactics. Led by the left communist Vladimir Smirnov, and initially with Stalin's encouragement, this, quote, military opposition challenged Lenin and Trotsky at the 8th Party Congress in March 1919, particularly over the abolition of elected party committees in the army. At a secret session of the Congress, they won more than a third of the delegates for their alternative. Soon afterwards, led by Smirnov, Osinsky, and Timofey Sopronov, the leftists formed the group of democratic centralists, parenthesis, more accurately, democratic anti-centralists, end parenthesis, to challenge the whole direction of the communist regime. They questioned Moscow's growing supremacy over the provinces, the primacy of the executive organs of the Soviets, and the dominance of party institutions over the government and other institutions at all levels. Defending the egalitarian idea and the, quote, collegial principle of administration by committees, the democratic centralists highlighted the excesses of military methods and the trend to hierarchies of individual authority throughout the political and economic system. A particularly strong center of decentralist sentiment capitalizing on the issue of autonomy for an ethnic minority, was the Ukraine. The issue of the minorities in the Russian Empire had divided left and right Bolsheviks before the revolution, with the left, notably Grigory Pyatakov, calling for, quote, proletarian internationalism, end quote, and the latter, the right Bolsheviks, including Lenin, endorsing national self-determination. In practice, when the leftists led by Pyatakov and the democratic centralist Andrei Bubnov gained control of the Communist Party in the Ukraine during the Civil War, the positions were reversed. The left advocated decentralization and the right insisting on centralism. In April 1920, Moscow ordered a thorough purge of the elected Ukrainian leadership and put an end to this base of opposition. Toward the middle of 1920, as a communist victory in the Civil War appeared assured, the left opposition was again invigorated, both in the form of the democratic centralists and in a new group based on the trade unions that took the name Workers' Opposition. Led by Shliapnikov, Alexander Kollontai, the Bolshevik feminist first commissar of social welfare and a left communist in 1918, and the metal workers' chief S.P. Medvedev, the Workers' Opposition harkened back to the workers' control movement of 1917 and called for the trade unions to run industry independently of the party. Kollontai denounced both bourgeois experts and communist bureaucrats and protested, quote, the working class as a class, is becoming an ever less important factor in the affairs of the Soviet Republic, end quote. Alexander Kollontai. The Workers' Opposition wanted to expel all non-proletarians from the party and require officials to work at least 3 months a year in manual labor. A light point of left opposition sentiment came at the Ninth Party Conference in September 1920, as support for both the Democratic Centralists and the Workers' Opposition peaked. Almost half the party members in Moscow supported one or the other. The Ninth Conference adopted a remarkable resolution affirming the norms of democracy and free criticism within the party and calling for steps to curb bureaucracy and eliminate economic inequality. All these developments set the stage for the most divisive controversy yet in the history of the Soviet Republic, specifically over the future role of trade unions in the communist system, but by implication over the prospects and methods for constructing the new society as a whole. The struggle was resolved at the 10th Party Congress in March 1921 with a decisive downturn in the fortunes of left communism. Divided between the anarchists and the authoritarians and embarrassed by the Kronstadt revolt, the leftists were powerless to stop Lenin's moves to terminate the revolution by introducing the new economic policy and abolishing factional freedom within the party. Thenceforth, any serious effort by the left to protest discrepancies between doctrine and practice was held to be a breach of the essence of Leninism that subjected critics to the irresistible power of the party secretariat and Central Control Commission. Nevertheless, echoes of the opposition of the war communism era continued to be heard. In March 1922, the Workers' Opposition vainly appealed to the Communist International against the suppression of, quote, workers' democracy in Russia. In 1923, one of their number, Gabriel Myasnikov, organized a new anti-bureaucratic movement, the Workers' Group, only to see it quickly suppressed. The Democratic Centralists made common cause with the Trotskyists in the, quote, New Course controversy over party democracy in December of 1923 to January 1924, the first in the series of fruitless efforts by the left opposition of the 1920s to reverse the trend towards totalitarianism. In 1927, the Democratic Centralists again appeared as a separate group to plead for the restoration of democracy in the party, only to be expelled along with the Trotskyists at the 15th Party Congress in December of that year, 1927. Most of the leaders of the opposition movement of 1918 to 1921 were liquidated in the purges of 1936 to 1938, without benefit of trial. An exception was Alexander Kollontai, who survived to serve as a Soviet diplomat until Kollontai's death in 1952. Perhaps the most exotic and certainly the longest-lived contribution of left communist thinking was the doctrine of revolutionary culture, the roots of which went back to Alexander Bogdanov in the early 1900s. Bogdanov and his followers proceeded from the exaggerated Marxian notions that all culture is class-bound, that truth and values for one class have no meaning for another, and that therefore the proletariat had to create its own culture and destroy the old bourgeois traditions. Though no longer a Bolshevik in 1917, Bogdanov was allowed shortly after the revolution to establish the proletarian culture movement, an attempt to evoke proletarian art and writing from actual proletarians. Disbanded by the party in 1921, Proletkult nevertheless had an echo in the anti-bureaucratic Workers' Truth organization that surfaced in 1923 to call for a new workers' party. like Myasnikov's workers' group, the workers' truth was quickly broken up by the police. Bogdanov's intellectual heirs, notably the historian Pokrovsky and the former democratic centralist Bubnov, as Commissar of Education, achieved their heyday when Stalin ended the intellectual tolerance of the NEP period and put the leftists briefly to work to impose tight controls on most fields of thought and culture in the name of the proletariat. This rule by the left proved to be short-lived. However, by the mid-1930s, Stalin was purging them everywhere and replacing them with people who would enforce his new conservative cultural standards. Hand in hand with their belief in proletarian class culture, the left communists affirmed that the new culture would be attained through the elimination of all traditional institutions of constraint over the individual. Thus, along with the, quote, withering away of the state, Kollontai preached the withering away of the family. P.I. Stuchka and Yevgeny Pashukanis argued for the withering away of law, and V.N. Shulgin anticipated the withering away of the school. Utopia was just around the corner, but the NEP put it off, and then Stalin took a different turn. The principles of left communism were the principles of the October Revolution. The makers of the revolution and the new regime were adherents of this leftism, or, like Lenin, had swung over to ride its crest to power. Left communism made the revolution, expressed the feelings that made the revolution possible, and gained its only substance through the revolution. The ultimate failure of left communism meant the failure of the revolution. In terms of personal background, the left opposition leaders were disproportionately connected with experience in pre-revolutionary emigration. Lenin, an emigre himself, used these people in 1917 to press his own radical agenda, but subsequently Lenin always managed to overcome them by appealing to members from the pre-revolutionary Russian underground, usually workers who had risen into the lower and middle levels of the post-revolutionary party bureaucracy. Typically impatient with theoretical disputations and democratic challenges to their own status, these apparatchiki provided the authoritarian nucleus for Stalin's rise to dominance in the party and the destruction of all opposition groups. A consistent set of ideas, grounded in the emigre experience, ran from one manifestation of left communism to the next. They were semi-anarchist utopians with an unbounded faith in the workers. They were anti-intellectual intellectuals or semi-intellectuals, particularly when it came to the employment of the technical intelligentsia in positions of authority over the workers. Parenthesis, this theme was temporarily revived by Stalin with his anti-expert show trials during the upheaval of 1928 to 32. In parenthesis. The left were internationalists with messianic assumptions about the impact of the Russian Revolution on the rest of the world. This is the conviction that mobilized them behind Lenin's drive for power in 1917, and just as emphatically turned them against Lenin in 1918. In social and cultural life, they meant to liberate the individual entirely from the grip of bourgeois tradition and mores. The left communists believed ardently in the process of democracy and political pluralism, but only for the working class, and after mid-1918, only within the framework of the single, quote, proletariat party, a fatal limitation as it turned out. They recognized from an early moment the drift of the new communist system away from the direct democracy and egalitarianism of 1917 and toward bureaucratic authoritarianism. Again and again, the left returned to the principle of the direct participation of the masses in administering their own destiny in government, in the military, in industrial relations. They disliked the money economy as a survival of capitalism and looked forward to egalitarian, quote, natural economy under communism. At bottom, left communism took seriously the violent road to the utopia of free and equal individuals. On the other hand, the left had little interest in the peasantry and made little of the potential issue of rural suffering. In failing, they nevertheless created a record of protest documenting the evolution of the Soviet system away from the utopianism of 1917. In almost every substantive respect, the Soviet regime sooner or later repudiated the principles of left communism that had embodied the revolutionary spirit of 1917. Internationalism. The real internationalism that could view communist power in Russia as something expendable was sacrificed by 1918. Participatory democracy in the government, army, and economy was on the way out just as soon, though its defenders were able to keep up a rearguard action for a few more years. Proletarian culture died in agony after it helped perfect Stalin's dictatorship. The goal of a classless society of free and equal citizens survived in Russia only as one of the more ironical pieties of party programs. Many factors contributed to the failure of the left between 1918 and 1921. The small Russian working class on which the opposition... Whoa! Jesus Christ. The dog tail, it scared me. Sorry, some dogs came up and scared me. My brother's dogs. The small Russian working class on which the opposition intended to rely was dissipated by the conditions of war communism. The opposition's anti-bureaucratic and anti-expert philosophy ran directly counter to the technology-based requirements of modern life and moreover defied the centralist habits of the Russian political tradition. Outside of Moscow and a few provincial centers, the opposition had no significant social base. The left was usually divided as it was between the Trotsky and Bukharin factions in the Brest-Litovsk controversy and between the democratic centralists, the workers' opposition, and the Trotskyists in 1920 to 1921. It lacked strong leaders able to stand effectively up to Lenin. Trotsky had the necessary charisma, but Trotsky was inclined to authoritarianism himself and vacillated at key moments. Bewitched by the mythology of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the left failed, with few exceptions, to challenge the communist monopoly of power or to question the terror tactics used against non-communists until they fell victim themselves when the one-party system was tightened into a one-faction system and then into a one-man system. With the latter expansion of communism outside the USSR, certain intriguing developments occurred that bore at least a superficial connection with the old principles of left communism. The first was the Yugoslav communist attempt after 1948 to decide where the evolution of socialism in Stalinist Russia had gone astray, and the consequent rediscovery and pro forma application of workers' control in the form of workers' councils and industry. In most other respects, however, the Yugoslav experiment drew more from the cautious and gradualist communism of the Russian NEP than from the ideas of left communism. Tito acted more like the late Bukharin of the right opposition than the early Bukharin of the left. A much more striking parallel with left communism can be found in the Maoism of communist China. After some years of cautious consolidation, reminiscent of the Soviet new economic policy, China launched into a series of convulsive, quote, revolutions from above that resembled the worst of Stalinism, curiously combined with the most extreme ideals of left communism. Among the dreams of 1918 to 1921 that came to life in China were rural communes, never more than the isolated experiments in Russia, espousal of revolutionary war, and finally the, quote, cultural revolution, recalling left communist precepts of proletarian culture, participatory democracy, and egalitarianism, even applying another unused Russian idea, the subjection of officials and intellectuals to extended terms of obligatory manual labor, In fact, the Maoists attempted far more seriously to implement the spirit of 1917 than was ever accomplished in Soviet Russia. It's a really apologetic understanding of the Cultural Revolution and Maoism in general. Needless to say, China's official Stalinism precluded any acknowledgement of the ideological debt that the Red Guards owed to Stalin's old enemies of the left opposition. In the spirit of left-wing utopianism was also conspicuous in revolutionary Cuba in the 1960s. There and among the Latin American adherents of Castroism, it was particularly the international aspect of leftism, revolutionary war, and the guerrilla approach to military operations, complete with militia committees, that attracted the most ardent revolutionaries. Again, there was no acknowledgement of the forerunners of these ideas, but the likeness underscored the difference in spirit between the Chinese and Cubans on the one hand, and the Soviet leadership on the other. It is tempting to wonder what the course of events might have been if the left communists had prevailed in the early Soviet political struggles. Reasonable speculation is difficult because different conditions have to be imagined to make the success of the left a realistic possibility. For one thing, as communists, they necessarily accepted the one-party dictatorship, though they worked against its implications. They thus made themselves a vulnerable target for the Leninist professionals who were less circumspect about the adjustments necessary to assure their own tenure of power. Second, the various groups of the left were unable to unite when it counted. At each stage of intra-party struggle, much of the potential opposition stood in the party leadership for political reasons, as for example the authoritarian left in 1919 to 20 and the Zinovievists in 1923 to 24. Finally, the isolated and backward circumstances of the Soviet state made a meaningful triumph of the left unlikely. The left communists themselves saw little hope for the kind of regime they wanted in the absence of international revolution. For a revolution confined to Russia, the domestic conditions of economic and cultural development were left were far short of what Marxists thought necessary to make the utopian hopes of the left feasible, and there is every reason to believe that a left communist leadership would have been worn down sooner or later. Equality would not turn the machines. Proletarian culture would not cure illiteracy. Revolutionary threats would not promote trade with the capitalists. On the other hand, if a communist revolution had spread quickly to one or more major powers, say Germany, this would have had incalculable consequences for the nature of the entire movement. Lacking the potential for a new revolution, the Russian left probably could not have sustained its ideals for long. The one-party dictatorship and the realities of political survival in a society racked by revolution and civil war reduced the anarchistic aspirations of the left to a misty dream. Left communist leadership could not have survived without postponing and effectively abandoning its distinctive character. Such a fall from virtue was shown early on by the authoritarian branch of the left when it made common cause with Lenin during war communism. But for what it counts, the leaders of the Russian left were personally honest and dedicated individuals, even though tarnished by the excesses of the party dictatorship. At the very least, they could hardly have been as cruel and mendacious as the people who came to power with Stalin. That's the end of the piece. Thanks for listening.